one area where I see a lot of vulnerability, and maybe the biggest energy security risk right now, is in the cyber side, is on the grid side. I think both the industry and having to respond to a fairly catastrophic event, but also to politicians thinking about how do we keep stability in a moment where industry is really being pressed.
In your opinion, what has actually changed in energy security? Why should we care about energy security? Well, on the 28th of April, we've had Spain and Portugal, majority parts of their whole society going down on the grid, stopping airports, train stations, trading, basic amenities, and even the tennis at the Madrid Open. You then look back to the UK on the 21st of March this year, where Heathrow was closed for a day, nearly 250,000 passengers were affected, and millions, if not billions of pounds affected by that chaos. Energy security is one of the most important topics today. We're delighted that last week we got into the inner sanctum of the world leaders and what they're discussing at the International Energy Agency Summit. Sit back, enjoy and relax our conversation with the Atlantic Council about what next for energy security. So, the world energy community is once again in the Wolfe Power Club's hometown of London. The reason why is the International Energy Agency and the UK government have hosted the Energy Security Summit. We are very, very lucky today, very fortunate today, to be joined by one of the great thought leaders from the other side of the world, the other side of the Atlantic, but it's the Atlantic Council's Landon. You're in London. How does it feel to be here?
Well, it's great to be back in London, and thank you for the generous opportunity to join the podcast. A timely conversation on energy security yesterday here with the IEA and with your government.
Now, I think we always have to really want to know our listeners. We're in over 60 countries. What does the council do? Because I guess from the title, people are thinking, this must be something NATO related, but you guys really own a lot of the energy discussion space. So just tell our listeners what you guys do.
Sure. Well, the Atlantic Council, good spot on NATO. The Atlantic Council had its origins behind NATO, right, and setting up global dialogue in capitals related to the NATO countries when it kicked off 75 years ago. It's grown from that. So it's an international think tank, predicated really on a strong United States, but with its partners and allies, building relationships globally, and kind of thinking through the policy issues that we need to tackle together. Of course, energy is a big part of that. I run the Global Energy Center. So at the Atlantic Council, we're thinking about energy policy in terms of how is energy affected by and affecting geopolitical affairs, national security, which is a global issue. This isn't something you can just contextualize in transatlantic relationship.
And listeners, in our show notes today, we'll put a link to the council. They've got some brilliant material on there, not just about what happens at the conferences, but some really great pieces on the nuclear sector and many other areas. So, yesterday, you were in the room with our Prime Minister Keir Starmer. You were in the room with Fatih Birol from the International Energy Association, the leader of the European Union, and Ed Miliband. But in your opinion, what has actually changed in energy security since those major world events of COVID and the Ukraine conflict?
I don't know that energy security itself has changed, right? The idea that we need access to reliable and affordable energy supplies, I think, permeates thinking from Tokyo to Washington, D.C., right, from north and south. What I'd tell you is COVID and the Ukraine crisis have really been triggers for two different components of it. COVID, supply security, just realizing how interconnected the world is, especially when it comes to energy supply, and really having an appreciation for where those energy trade flows move, and how they're kind of growing and changing as the energy resource base grows as well, right? I think on the Ukraine conflict, it's a stark reminder that energy can be weaponized by our adversaries, and Moscow deliberately put in place a problem that's raising energy prices across Europe, and reflecting that we have to be thoughtful about where our supply is coming from and who we're partnering with to bring that to market.
And I think what our listeners might not actually understand is in the nuts and bolts of the industry is the impact it actually had. I remember at the time that I was running one of the biggest, largest diesel supply chains in the UK. For that product, you need AdBlue. And because the price of gas went up so much, basically all of our suppliers were doing force majeure, and that it was cheaper to close a factory than it was to provide AdBlue. And suddenly, like, you genuinely were weeks without stock. And I think that the Western world probably hadn't seen that for a considerable time. Is that kind of reflected by some of the organisations that support the council? Did they have similar stories or sort of those sort of frustrations? But on the flip side, it also seems that the energy community has, found a solution to stuff.
I mean, I think the energy community is incredibly resilient and will find ways to resolve problems. But what you're talking about is a temporal element, right? We need to be able to have a response to those supply shocks that kick in. And I think this goes to your original question. Is energy security particularly different today? Not necessarily. Yesterday's event was held by the International Energy Agency. That was created in a response to the 1970s oil shocks, right? And we set up strategic reserves and stocks at the time because we knew that there are moments of real specific vulnerability. Now that system can be refined. How we get that to market, if it's crude versus actual petroleum products and distillates that the market needs to consume and have on hand, we're always refining these things. But I definitely think it stress tests the system pretty aggressively. Maybe more COVID than Ukraine. But both really big moments.
Yeah, because I think we saw that you had this sort of weird combination that lots of parts of the world were locked up, but actually things like distribution, energy needs, more people spending time at home, more people getting stuff delivered on the supply chain. So you had this kind of weird counterbalance on some parts, workers couldn't run entire supply chains, but on the flip side, the supply chains had never been in more demand.
Yeah. Well, after the first week of COVID and realizing you can't have happy hour every day, and it's going to go on for a while, we really got to work. And I was in the U.S. government at the time, and watching WTI prices, West Texas Intermediate crude prices, drop below zero was a testament, I think, both to industry and having to respond to a fairly catastrophic event, but also to politicians thinking about how do we keep stability in a moment where industry is really being pressed to meet demand in a moment where we don't have value to the product, right? So it was an incredible moment.
We've just risen about what happened in 1973, but the world does feel vulnerable. Like I'm not going to come here and say, look, we're meeting in London, everyone's quite relaxed about the world. It was purely a sort of meeting exercise. So would you say the world is more vulnerable now than 1973? I appreciate we're both young men, so like, we weren't actually maybe in the thick of it in 1973. But in terms of like the feeling in the room yesterday, you were with like the top 120 leaders in the world that are stakeholders in this, bar some obvious exceptions. But did it feel more vulnerable?
I don't know if we feel more vulnerable, but I will say it is a refreshing reminder that we need to be thinking about energy security and not just net zero transitions, right? That there's a real aspect that you can do both, but that energy security is going to be a feature of our lives no matter what the energy system looks like. And so the idea that we're more vulnerable today or not, I think we're vulnerable in different ways, right? Oil and gas, fossil energy, oil, gas, coal make up 80% of the global energy mix still. So that is a perpetual vulnerability that we're going to have to tackle, both from industry and from government. But now we're introducing a variety of additional technologies, a bigger grid, bigger digitalization. And so I think both from a cyber element or, this really strong conversation that's starting on critical minerals and the inputs, the raw materials for the energy system that is being increasingly introduced to the global energy mix, those are new vulnerabilities. And we're going to have those pressures and the geopolitics behind them for as long as we have working economies.
It makes me reflect actually then on something that's quite clear yesterday. You always see national leaders bang on about cheap energy prices, jobs in their own country, spend, but sustainability. But there does seem an obvious elephant in the room here, in that especially the UK and the Germany that were both at the conference yesterday, They have basically had decades of stopping nuclear development for different reasons, whether it's raising money, political tensions, people being anti-nuclear, but also now people are like, we don't really have access to cheap pricing, to cheap costs. Sustainability-wise, we don't want to bring coal back into the mix. But it seems like to me there's not a hugely pragmatic approach. Does the council feel that whether it's nuclear or something else, how do we get back to a pragmatic way that if you want cheaper energy, you kind of need that supply from different industries? So what's your feeling of how can we take a pragmatic approach to that?
Well, I'm not sure Angela Merkel regrets taking nuclear out of the system, but I think maybe the citizens of Germany might, because you need that baseload power, you need assured energy, and it's not just about the levelized cost of energy to supply. It's how are you getting it to consumers and what's the delivered cost. And these new technologies come with investment, right? There might be, yesterday Prime Minister Starmer noted a $2 trillion market opportunity. There may be a $2 trillion market opportunity in clean energy, but that means that it's because we're spending $2 trillion to build out a grid and build out new technologies. And so it's an expensive proposition. And I think especially if you're going to have intermittent renewable energy technology on the grid, you really need to also be thinking about what does it cost to make sure I have the resiliency and backup in battery storage and grid infrastructure so that you don't have rolling brownouts or blackouts because of that supply. So I think in terms of pragmatism and specifically in terms of an area like yesterday's audience with 60 plus countries represented at this event in this Energy Security Summit, I really think that there are certain through lines, nuclear energy being one of them, where if we can get that working properly, if we can be constructive together, see some of these small modular reactors built, we can start providing some of that sure baseload power for countries like the United Kingdom that don't have the same endowed resource base that the United States does. And I think that that's an area where Europe and the United States could really come together.
And I think it's nice to talk about the States. For our listeners that don't know, obviously I've done a bit of LinkedIn stalking, but you're well known for, you've done a number of different roles for the US Department of Energy over a decade before you joined the council. I'm interested whether it's actually the security side of sort of threats from others, whether it's changing in the weather, or whether it's just like the US economy, changing. Like we all saw that when the president came in, there was a huge focus on the tech bros. What the tech bros means that things like AI, crypto have vastly huge energy demands. And for our listeners, go to one of our back episodes of where we talked about the US grid and the challenges there. But as someone who comes with over a decade of working in the department, what do you think the energy security issues are for the United States today?
It's interesting because now, unlike 2005, you go back to 2005, the United States was importing 12 million barrels of oil a day. It's actually pretty akin to where China is at the moment in terms of its supply insecurity. We go into the shale revolution, and now the United States is both a net exporter of oil and natural gas, right? So we have an abundance, and that comes with a different thinking. And I think maybe a little bit of a false sense of security sometimes by our political establishments as they think, we have energy independence and security at home. I would tell you the one area where I see a lot of vulnerability and maybe the biggest energy security risk right now is in the cyber side, is on the grid side. When you think about where we've literally seen challenges to the U.S. energy system, Colonial Pipeline, which is a big pipeline for gasoline and distillates coming to the East Coast from the Gulf Coast, was shut down by a cyber attack. The FBI, if you can Google this for those interested. The FBI's watched while we've had physical attacks on grid infrastructure, and so I think that is an area where we have to be a little bit more focused. It's harder to be able to ring fence that because it's pervasive. This infrastructure is throughout our countries.
It certainly, I know, having worked in the AI side of big energy, that these attacks are very, very real. Like it's similar in our territories. In the North Sea, there's been cyber attacks, on a regular basis, and we're not trying to fear the listener here, but this is what's going on. We have other bits of infrastructure where essentially, there's weather issues, and I mean very basic stuff like suddenly huge flooding, which means you have to close down a facility, or very high winds, and I think we are seeing more extremes of weather. Is there certain geographical parts of the US that you feel have greater weaknesses than others? Because we quite often hear of the states that really invest into energy on this podcast, but sometimes we don't hear about the ones that don't invest because the stories aren't happening there. So I was just wondering if there's parts of America you say actually they might have more of an issue than others.
Well, interesting question. Not an area I spend a ton of time on. Resilience in general, though, where you're seeing this affected, I think, in my mind, Florida, you're seeing the real consequence of climate change and the real property markets as people struggle to get flood and hurricane insurance in places that are prone to natural disasters. I think out west, for those that don't know the geography of the United States too well, the west is a pretty dry part. When you get to those Rocky Mountains, there's some water scarcity and droughts. And so when you're thinking about building out AI infrastructure and data centers in Phoenix, Arizona, I'm told that they can do it and they have the technology and that the water cycles are closed loop. But, these are issues you have to be thinking about because the environment is changing and how companies and how governments adapt to that is quite critical right now.
So that leads us nicely to the energy trilemma. Obviously that balance between energy security, energy affordability, energy sustainability is always going to consume the listeners on this podcast. But it's been really high level in the UK in the past few weeks. And the reason it's been really high level is that Ed Miliband, who you were in the room with yesterday, even though he's just been there barely half a year, they feel that the policies to close down coal has actually put the price up, and it means very energy intensive industries like the steel industry. Government had an emergency meeting in Britain to see how we could resolve the problems with the Chinese ownership and keep steel production happening in the UK. And then on top of that, household bills are at extremely high level, to the point where Miliband was also talking about this week even having different price levels for richer parts of the country. There was something about, like, in the south of England, different tariffs. How do we get back to a way where we get sort of cheaper electricity? Because one of the things that Simon French, the big economist, was saying was that back in sort of 2010, the electricity price kilowatt per hour between the US and UK was quite similar, and then now it's about a 20p or 25 cents difference per kilowatt hour. So very intensive stuff. The knock-on effects hits all our industries. How do we get back to better prices?
Yeah, I would tell you there's no issue, I think, politically that people are more sensitive to than fuel prices, consumer prices, whether it's fuel or electricity. And we're watching in real time in the United States as voters change their political preferences based on the cost of energy. So I can understand why Minister Miliband is exercised about this issue and thinking about the real politics of potentially leveling a higher fee on wealthier neighborhoods, because you have to be able to look at your political livelihood, and there's nothing more that's going to drive this. If we're going to push towards lower prices, though, I think, my take would be, number one, let's stop mixing up and conflating fossil fuels and emissions. I think it's really important to look at those in separate spaces. There is not an easy path to low fuel prices, low energy prices, in which we don't really recognize the scale and reality of fossil energy, right? 80%, I already mentioned that, of global supply today. That's not ebbing quickly. And the more we invest in the sector, and the more we expect the sector to also still, abate its methane emissions, think about the long-term impacts of how it decarbonizes the sector, it's fine. But you don't cut that back because you're really stressing the ability for affordability now. We also have to look at really capital-intensive projects and decide if we have the political will for governments to support the construction of nuclear plants in particular. I think France, amongst the craziness of European electric power prices, has looked actually pretty resilient because of those decisions. Outside of drought, has looked very consistent in terms of its ability to provide comparatively reliable power prices, right? And so that level of foresight from policymakers, I think, is incredibly critical. But that comes with a cost, and you have to be able to find the budget and be able to explain to consumers why that is. What you can't do is tell people we're going to go deep on solar and wind only, and it's going to cut your power bills by 50%, and then watch a 3x in the price of electricity, right? It's a dishonest conversation at that point. We're better off recognizing that we should be using all energy sources. Why wouldn't the United Kingdom want to tap abundant, rich offshore wind? But also you want to have oil and gas, you want to have nuclear, a real all of the above approach.
Because I'm also interested in, and just for the record, my grandfather actually was part of the team that built the interconnectors under the sea between the UK and France, so we could sell off access to each other and that sort of infrastructure, back sort of 60, 70 years ago. But I think where we also saw real highlights of weakness was that we saw a situation in the last month where the world's fourth biggest airport, Heathrow, our gateway to the whole world. I'm sure the majority of the conference that was from outside the UK yesterday came in via Heathrow, and it went down for the best part of a whole day due to a substation fire. They haven't quite revealed, what caused that fire, whether it was purely accidental and a maintenance issue, or whether it was something more deep than that. But I'm interested. It does look like the weakness at ports and at airports around the world could be a common problem. Does yesterday's discussions or views of the council have any ideas about how we stop that vulnerability?
I think stopping the vulnerability is pretty overt, right? You need redundance in the power system, right? You can't just rely on one substation that has a critical vulnerability and a critical aspect of supply to be the linchpin to global commerce. That Heathrow is not just about people getting in and out of London. And there's been many trips I've taken that have flown through Heathrow to get to wherever else I'm doing business. And I think that that idea and aspect of resilience, it comes down again to explaining to consumers, to the broader community, that you need to be able to invest in some of these duplicative pieces of infrastructure, especially at a port, or especially in the context of Heathrow or another airport of that scale. This isn't a podcast of conspiracy theories, but I do like the fact that you're pointing out that there's a challenge and we don't know the cause of why that happened. Right? It could be totally benign, but we can't assume it is, because I know the subsea cables that are being cut right now by ships dragging anchors. That's not a benign cause, right? There's a real intent. I don't know any ship captain that typically draws its anchors across the Baltic Sea for 50 kilometers. That's not a normal course of business. And so, I want people to be aware, and I think this is part of what the Atlantic Council is doing, is we're not being alarmists, but we also need to realize there are real geopolitical challenges in the world. There are adversaries. The world's not purely benevolent. And frankly, a lot of countries are self-interested. We often conflate supply security with national interests and with climate vulnerability to make the best narrative that's conducive for what I want to sell. And I think the more we compartmentalize those, think about those uniquely separate, and then think how they affect each other, the stronger the policies will be, the more certainty we can provide to the business industry, and we can respond to these issues over the long term in a really thoughtful way.
So that sounds pretty good. Yesterday, in terms of opportunity costs, a lot of world leaders, including yourself and your respective thought leader piece, gave up the day to discuss these issues. And I guess from the outside, if I'm being a bit brutally honest, that it's we've got a leadership team in the UK that want to be part of the international community. The IEA has always stood for sort of parts of energy security, so coming to London with a willing government makes sense. But what did you really get out the summit? And I know you've also been having other meetings in town around it. What did you see of like the real wins from the summit that we can build on going into the year ahead?
It's a little bit of Europe, the international community doing a wake up about the importance of energy security again. I don't know that there was a specific deliverable, but we're coming off of 5 years in continental Europe of the Green New Deal, right? The walls of La Berlaymont, if you go to Brussels, were solar power adorned. They're now speaking to a really humble conversation of unity. And I think you're seeing the reality that we need to not be just talking about climate. It's okay to talk about the energy trilemma holistically, but the security vulnerabilities, consumer price, political stability, economic opportunity is equally important, if not more. And if, in my opinion, coming from Washington, D.C., people are always going to make decisions based on national security first, then economic opportunity, and then long-term durability and sustainability, environmental sustainability of the system. And so you can't ignore it. And so what did we learn yesterday? I don't know. It was a comprehensive conversation, a lot of world leaders coming together. But the big thing is it's back on the agenda. Energy security is back on the agenda, and it needs to stay there. And that's going to be a conversation that you'll hear from the new executive with President Trump's administration in Washington, D.C. I think that'll resonate a lot from Washington. But it's a global conversation. And I know that's one we're taking on the road as we travel around the world with the Atlantic Council.
Beautiful. Well, absolutely brilliant insights about what was happening in yesterday. We've got a few quick fire questions.
All right,
We ask all of our guests. The first quick fire, because you kind of have a sort of relationship to all three. In the next 12 months, and probably maybe around energy, let's say, because it's too big a beast to handle in a quick fire, what are you looking for from the US administration, the UK administration, and the EU administration?
I've alluded to this already. Look, nuclear energy, I want, on the energy space, I want to see us make one really good policy decision. We need to build some of these small modular reactors. We need to prove proof of concept. Let's stop talking about it. Let's actually start creating real baseload power that's from nuclear energy. And can we start that one again? I'm like gummed up. Okay. I think for my take, if I had one thing, I've alluded to it before, nuclear energy is, I think, an incredibly important component that we seize back. We're watching a lot of nuclear power be built internationally. Most of it's from China and Russia. This is an area where we have a collective interest to move forward. So I'm hoping that we actually make some forward progress on not just talking about SMRs, but actually building some of this infrastructure here in the UK, here in the United States, wherever we can get it built.
And just actually a follow-up question on SMRs and small nuclear reactors. There was a bit of a negative piece recently in the UK and in the papers about this vast underinvestment in manned security. Is that a real issue, or is that a bit of a red herring because actually the complicated issue of investment was too difficult for the journalists to look into?
Well, a little bit leading the witness here, but I do think that I think we have a really good architecture around how to secure these facilities. The new technologies, SMRs, have passive measures to be able to actually more safe, more resilient than their predecessors. So, whether it comes from guns, gates, guards, or cyber or other aspects, I think we're well situated to be able to make sure these are safe.
Another interesting thing is there seems to be loads of cost issues, loads of problems politically. But would you say the energy space is still an opportunity for that entrepreneur to become a millionaire or even a billionaire today? Or do you think those days have gone and only really big nationals can do it?
No, I think that this is a space where everybody should be engaging, especially in the novel technologies, the new technologies that are out there. One of my favorite companies to work with right now is the geothermal space. Watching people be innovative about taking technologies that we learned, for example, in the fracking revolution, and be able to tap new technologies. Those aren't the majors. That's not Exxon going out there and creating this. And so I do think that there's opportunities for entrepreneurs to really engage. And it does come with a degree of needing expertise in the space. But people can learn that, pick up a couple books, get to work. But I totally believe that people can have vibrant careers here. Although don't join a nonprofit if you're looking to become a millionaire.
Talking about experts and expertise, you probably have one of the best connection books in the world in the energy sector. We love interesting characters on this podcast. Who should be next from your contact book?
Well, the one piece that I have really enjoyed recently is by Jeff Curry, the new Joule Order, like Joule of Energy. The new Joule Order. He just put that out in March. And if you haven't had him on the podcast yet, see if he would come on board. He's at Carlyle Group now, former Goldman Sachs. But a really interesting piece, an honest piece, right, of how people and how nations with their own self-interest in mind are grappling with this idea of transition with energy security. Makes a compelling case that there is an energy transition ongoing. It's a transition of electrification. It's been going on for a century. Since 1950, we've gone from 2% fully electrified to about 20%. So there is a slope, but the slope might be slower than people would like to admit on just the pure clean energy side. But on the flip side, there is an opportunity here where the molecules that we're producing, whether it's oil and natural gas, could be used for domestic value add as opposed to being exported. So some interesting ideas, not about peak oil, not about peak demand, but now about peak trade. So see if you can coax him into a trip to London and to join you, because it's a really good piece.
That'd be amazing. And we always love those people that have a passion of investment and energy. That's a great book shout. Final question before we let people know how they can stay in contact with the work of the council is that the customer. Quite often we don't focus enough on the customer. Obviously, a lot of yesterday was about how we benefit the customer or big populations. But in the next 12 months, what would you like customers to do to actually improve the energy ecosystem?
Look, when it comes to customers, I think we had a twofold conversation on energy security. There is a cost to having an energy security grid, to the investments that we need to make to be able to have affordable and reliable supply. So I think you have to have some patience and reflect on the fact that power's not free. It may feel like a human right nowadays, but the industry has to be able to have a revenue stream. I think for the customers also thinking about how important it is for them on what the makeup is of the energy system, I think you should reflect on the realities of what we're supplying and what's available today to make it affordable.
Wow, fantastic.
And that's natural gas right now. It is renewable energy and electric, connections with broader Europe. But you need all of it. And so just realize you do need all of it. And that's going to be the case for a while.
Now, we're delighted you're in our city. Thank you very much. You've had a ram-packed timetable to squeeze us in. Has been absolutely brilliant. Just for our listeners, what's the best way of staying in touch with Council? And I understand every summer you guys have a big summit and conference. We'll put in show notes your website, but what's the best way to stay in contact?
Well, if we can get you across the Atlantic in June, you're welcome to join us in Washington, D.C. We're having our 9th annual Atlantic Council Global Energy Forum. It'll be live broadcast, so people can watch the conversations from world leaders, from U.S. government officials come to their homes and their computers around the world. It is there to be the preeminent conversation on the geopolitics of energy. It's international. We're hoping that some of the new leadership in Washington, D.C. Don't just articulate what American first means, but how you contextualize these new energy dominance policies in a very global energy system. So we'll be doing that at atlanticcouncil.org. You can follow our work there, but of course, look at the Global Energy Forum, June 17th, 18th in Washington, D.C. Everybody's welcome to join.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Thank you. And I hope you enjoyed London.
Oh, this is a great time. Always happy to be here, and I would look forward to coming back at a future date.